¿Todo descargado o todo?
So we'll see. So I should put on this thing. Well, this will be an experiment. So I'm Joe Dumit. I'm an anthropologist at University of California, Davis. And I'm a cultural anthropologist, the kind that studies cultures. And my cultures are usually knowledge makers, researchers. I study neuroscientists, pharmaceutical marketers, how they design clinical trials. And here I'm talking about some work I did with geologists and computer scientists. And I've spent the last 6 years getting pulled into contact improvisation by lots of performance studies graduate students who are all senior researchers or teachers in contact improvisation. So I've kind of combined these researches together. And this is a quote from somebody in my field, Bruno Latour in Paris. He says, "A subject only becomes interesting, deep, profound, and worthwhile when he/she/it resonates with others, is affected, moved, put into motion by new entities whose differences are registered in new and unexpected ways." And one of the things I've been doing is, as I've said, I've always been thinking of scientists as doing something like contact improvisation, all scientists, that they don't know what they're doing. And that as soon as they know what they're doing, it becomes boring. I mean, they have to do protocols and equipment and stuff like that, but that surprises them constantly, and they have to improvise with regard to that. But what really excites them is when they're falling through data, through research subjects, things like that, things where they don't know what's going to happen next. And then they write in such a way that it looks like they planned it all along. And it's one of the great tricks of scientists is to claim, there's even a guy who made a whole study of this, Hans-Jörg Reinberger, he called it historiality. It's the retelling your whole story as if there were no mistakes at all and you always knew where you were going. And you can find all these precise moments where a scientist stumbles and he's like, oh, that's where I was going, to the ground. And it's really how research happens. And what's interesting also is science, and I just attended a whole week with neuroscientists and meditators trying to talk to each other. And all of them used the word embodiment, and all of them used metaphors of dance. Sometimes they literally said, this dances with that, subjectivity dances with the environment. But none of them dance. Dance is this amazingly kind of static metaphor. And I say, well, would it matter what kind of dance you do? Would it matter if you knew that you could actually play with leading and following and get lost in about 12 seconds? And I do this little finger thing that most of us have done in introductory CI classes, where I say, follow my finger with your finger. And then I say, I'm following you right now. And they're like, because they hadn't thought through agency. They spend a lot of time talking about it, but hadn't if you meditate, it's hard. You actually make agency into the problem. Am I in control of my thoughts or am I watching my thoughts? And in CI, we're always experimenting with the way in which we're always leading and following. So, one place where you can actually kind of watch scientists actually dance is when they have to use their bodies to figure things out. So I've been, see if this works. So I'm calling this like embodying improvisation, haptic creativity. Haptic is a word that means using your body. So how you use your body to be creative, and research presence and field work with scientists. So I, as an anthropologist, my technique, my method is literally called deep hanging out. Just hang out with people until you you use your body as the instrument through which you understand how they do what they do and know what they know. This probably won't work very well, but one of the things that at UC Davis, geologists and computer science collaborated, and they made a cave. It's a room about the size of this rug area, a little bit bigger, in which the 3 walls and the floor are all projection surfaces. And then you walk into this room and you put on 3D glasses, and data floats in front of you. It's like virtual reality, except that in virtual reality you feel like you're somewhere else. In the cave, you just feel like this data has become an object in your world. So it literally floats there like this, except that you can grab it and make it giant or make it really tiny, which for geologists is great because sometimes they have a scan of an entire area of a planet and they want to shrink it down and then find another area. And other times they have a microscopic rock and they've scanned it and they want to blow it up really big. And then you can stick your head in it and you can grab it and twist it and you can say, you can take an MRI and say, I really like this area, and say all the other pixels of the same density color yellow, and you'll just get a shape in 3-dimensional space of some brain region. So it's an amazing tool to orient, but it's a disorienting tool. The person running it, it's like, I don't know if you've ever done ultrasound. The person holding the wand in ultrasound knows where they are, follow what's happening, because the way their hand moves changes this wand in 3-dimensional space. And if you're holding it, you can see something. You see a baby. And if you are watching it, you have to wait until they catch an angle where the baby becomes visible. So this is just, resolution's not good, but you can see this is a guy, we've scanned him too using Connects, so he's like a 3D person in his 3D data. But it gives you a sense of how he feels like he's actually in the data. And he can kind of grab this. This is an earthquake, and he's trying to measure some things on it. And we do lots of things in the cave. I'm happy to send you links or talk about these later. I won't bother now. And so, one more quote to think with. This is, when disciplines meet, and we've spent our EC group the last week and a half trying to talk to each other from 7 different disciplines at least. This quote from a philosopher, Gilles Deleuze: the encounter between 2 disciplines doesn't take place when one reflects on the other, but when one discipline realizes that it has to resolve for itself a problem similar to one confronted by another. So this is like when geology and computer science come together, they don't actually create the same problem, but what they do is they each teach each other how they confront a problem, and it inspires them to think of something analogous, right? And this is kind of, it's like we each have a score, and the fact that we're each doing a different score and don't even know our partner's score nonetheless allows us to improvise more. Like new things emerge with each new person you dance with. So it's this kind of idea on a kind of bigger time scale. And that's what I'm tracking a lot of the time, is how new disciplines form or how science changes. And here I'm interested in when geologists get a tool where they can actually stick their head inside their data, how does it change the way they do geology? That was my question here. Let me just give you a couple examples. What I track, one of the things I've tracked is like the difference between experts and non-experts. So if I show you, as someone who hasn't done geology, I'm making assumptions here, if I showed you geological data in the cave, you'd probably spend half an hour saying how cool it was. Because it is really amazing to float among all these earthquakes and see spirals and things, but you wouldn't get much past how cool it is. And maybe thinking, wow, I don't know anything about earthquakes. But if I take an earthquake scientist who hasn't seen it 3-dimensionally in there, they'll say, oh my God, this is amazing for about a minute. And then they'll start doing geology. They'll like sink into the data and they'll be like, oh, this is what that subduction zone is doing. And oh, I always wondered where that was coming from. And they'll just be become immersed by it. They'll become completely captivated by it. And so watching the difference between an expert exploring their own data and others exploring data generates a big difference. That's interesting. And so one of our focuses here, one of the things we all share, is the idea that CI people have been doing CI for a while, are experts in something that's hard to capture. And how do we want to kind of talk about that expertise and turn that expertise into an instrument and a tool, right? Into something through which we can learn more. And we all do this in our daily practice of CI and other things, where it's a tool of inquiry for us. And part of our, I think our collective goal is to like open more of the research world to dance and improvisational work as research. Not just as things to study, but actually all of us being researchers. And Asaf has a vision of all of us being researchers in a collective sense that's like more, you could say, societally recognized. And I think in general, the everyday expertise of people doesn't fold into science very easily. Yeah, this isn't coming out enough, but she's like inside a thigh of a horse, looking at the fascial structure of a racehorse thigh muscle. And it's quite amazing because their tendon structure is really different than our quadriceps. They have all these cross-cutting links. So basically it's lots of short muscles become one long thing. So they don't stretch very far, but they're amazingly powerful, right? It's an innovation, and they hadn't been able to see it, the structure of it, until they were able to bring it into 3D, because MRIs don't resolve properly that way. And then other scientists try to figure out how snowflakes grow. Oh, so yes. One of the things you can sort of see here is how the researcher is like maneuvering her body in order to understand the data. And this is this area that I'm really fascinated by, which is part of what I'm calling haptic creativity. And this is work I've done with Natasha Myers, who was a student of mine at MIT and then is an anthropologist of science as well. She was a dancer, and she studied protein crystallographers. How do scientists figure out how a protein, we know all the atoms in it, but it folds to become this like living little thing. And they breathe, they twist, they do all this stuff, but they're really small. And figuring out how they're shaped is really difficult. And so they can generate what's called X-ray crystallography data, but then they have to figure out, well, how does it actually work? They have data, but it doesn't actually give them the shape. And it doesn't tell them what the living shape is. And she discovered that they even called figuring out their molecule dancing it. And they literally would use their bodies in the data to understand it. And some of the senior ones would say if the graduate student couldn't actually learn to think three-dimensionally with their body, they wouldn't be a good crystallographer. Because the two-dimensional picture you get isn't the story. And they would sometimes have to grab each other and say, oh, I think it's working like this, and use two other people's arms to make structures happen. So I'm interested in these moments where, and the cave is great because it's so clunky as a data tool, that it like stretches the moment of scientific discovery really wide open. Because they're hanging out with their data, but they can't quite figure out what's there. And in that moment, they're talking. So it's like I get a window into stuff that usually happens inside the head. Here, because they have to use their bodies, we can see this process follow what's happening, because the way their hand moves changes this wand in three-dimensional space. And if you're holding it, you can see something. You see a baby. And if you are watching it, you have to wait until they catch an angle where the baby becomes visible. So this is just, resolution's not good, but you can see this is a guy, we've scanned him too using Connect, so he's like a 3D person in his 3D data. But it gives you a sense of how he feels like he's actually in the data, and he can kind of grab this. This is an earthquake, and he's trying to measure some things on it. And we do lots of things in the cave. I'm happy to send you links or talk about these later. I won't bother now. And so, one more quote to think with. This is when disciplines meet, and we've spent our EC group the last week and a half trying to talk to each other from 7 different disciplines at least. This quote from a philosopher, Gilles Deleuze: "The encounter between 2 disciplines doesn't take place when one reflects on the other, but when one discipline realizes that it has to resolve for itself a problem similar to one confronted by another." So this is like when geology and computer science come together, they don't actually create the same problem, but what they do is they each teach each other how they confront a problem, and it inspires them to think of something analogous, right? And this is kind of, it's like we each have a score, and the fact that we're each doing a different score and don't even know our partner's score nonetheless allows us to improvise more. Like new things emerge with each new person you dance with. So it's this kind of idea on a kind of bigger time scale. And that's what I'm tracking a lot of the time, is how new disciplines form or how science changes. And here I'm interested in when geologists get a tool where they can actually stick their head inside their data, how does it change the way they do geology? That was my question here. Let me just give you a couple examples. What I track, one of the things I've tracked is like the difference between experts and non-experts. So if I show you, as someone who hasn't done geology, I'm making assumptions here, if I showed you geological data in the cave, you'd probably spend half an hour saying how cool it was. Because it is really amazing to float among all these earthquakes and see spirals and things, but you wouldn't get much past how cool it is. And maybe thinking, wow, I don't know anything about earthquakes. But if I take an earthquake scientist who hasn't seen it 3-dimensionally in there, they'll say, oh my God, this is amazing for about a minute, and then they'll start doing geology. They'll like sink into the data, and they'll be like, oh, this is what that subduction zone is doing, and oh, I always wondered where that was coming from. And they'll just become immersed by it. They'll become completely captivated by it. And so watching the difference between an expert exploring their own data and others exploring data generates a big difference. That's interesting. And so one of our focuses here, one of the things we all share, is the idea that CI people have been doing CI for a while, are experts in something that's hard to capture. And how do we want to kind of talk about that expertise and turn that expertise into an instrument and a tool, right? Into something through which we can learn more. And we all do this in our daily practice of CI and other things, where it's a tool of inquiry for us. And part of I think our collective goal is to like open more of the research world to dance and improvisational work as research, not just as things to study, but actually all of us being researchers. And Asaf has a vision of all of us being researchers in a collective sense that's like more, you could say, societally recognized. And I think in general, the everyday expertise of people doesn't fold into science very easily. Yeah, this isn't coming out enough, but she's like inside a thigh of a horse, looking at the fascial structure of a racehorse thigh muscle. And it's quite amazing because their tendon structure is really different than our quadriceps. They have all these cross-cutting links. So basically it's lots of short muscles become one long thing. So they don't stretch very far, but they're amazingly powerful, right? It's an innovation, and they hadn't been able to see it, the structure of it, until they were able to bring it into 3D, because MRIs don't resolve properly that way. And then other scientists try to figure out how snowflakes grow. Oh, so yes. One of the things you can sort of see here is how the researcher is like maneuvering her body in order to understand the data. And this area that I'm really fascinated by, which is part of what I'm calling haptic creativity. And this is work I've done with Natasha Myers, who was a student of mine at MIT and then is an anthropologist of science as well. She was a dancer, and she studied protein crystallographers. How do scientists figure out how a protein, we know all the atoms in it, but it folds to become this like living little thing? And they breathe, they twist, they do all this stuff, but they're really small. And figuring out how they're shaped is really difficult. And so they can generate what's called X-ray crystallography data, but then they have to figure out, well, how does it actually work? They have data, but it doesn't actually give them the shape. And it doesn't tell them what the living shape is. And she discovered that they even called figuring out their molecule dancing it. And they literally would use their bodies in the data to understand it. And some of the senior ones would say if the graduate student couldn't actually learn to think three-dimensionally with their body, they wouldn't be a good crystallographer. Because the two-dimensional picture you get isn't the story. And they would sometimes have to grab each other and say, oh, I think it's working like this, and use two other people's arms to make structures happen. So I'm interested in these moments where, and the cave is great because it's so clunky as a data tool, that it like stretches the moment of scientific discovery really wide open. Because they're hanging out with their data, but they can't quite figure out what's there. And in that moment, they're talking. So it's like I get a window into stuff that usually happens inside the head. Here, because they have to use their bodies, we can see this process of the next crystal of a snowflake expanding. Right? And hanging out in this texture, in this three-dimensional texture, he started getting a feeling for this mathematical structure. And this is just another statement. It says, data is manipulable and explorable object in the world to be able to be played with. So in this case, what they've done is they've made their data big enough to work at the scale of their body. So it's haptic. Now their body comes into play. If you work through a microscope, I mean, literally your hands are here and they're basically on joysticks and your head's like this and you're fixed and you're talking. And so you have to generate things via voice. But in these kinds of things, their bodies are involved because they are literally using the cave to make their data the same size as their body. And then they're literally doing contact improvisation with it. They're moving it. They're moving themselves into it. And all of that motion is part of how they're understanding it. And then the problem is, this is why I became a member of the research team, is that they couldn't, it was hard to publish because their insights were coming from a different direction. And other geologists were like, I don't get it. Why do you need a big expensive cave to understand? And they say, and the geologists here said, well, it's completely changed the way I work. So I had to work with them to rewrite some of the interdisciplinary protocols for the NSF. And, we're trying to cheat slowly our way into having this type of research accepted. And to do that, we have to change what journals think is data. And this is the job of trying to get contact improvisation or dance or even movement into neuroscience, is that neuroscience is we've got along fine without it for 60 years. Why do we need it?
We've got rats.
Huh?
We've got
rats, exactly. Yeah. So, if you had been part of our conversations the last week, they've been very kind of painful because we have all these great ideas, and this is how scientists work too. We have all these great ideas, and we realize, well, if we want to study it, we have to make it pretty simple, pretty dumb. But then at least we can start building an infrastructure of knowledge that we can build up. And all scientists have this same frustration. They have these great questions, but the demands of actually trying to prove something, in other words, make something reliable show up, causes you to actually publish a very small question. And a lot of the creativity is in the scientific research team trying to figure out how to do the research in the first place. That's where a lot of amazing conversations happen. And then the scientist eventually retires and writes a beautiful book about consciousness or memory or something like that. That's the joke about neuroscientists. You dream about memory, you think it's this beautiful thing, and then you cut up rat brains for 60 years and make little micro measurements, and it doesn't really mean anything. And then you retire and you write this beautiful book about memory. And you get to say all the things that you can't say as a scientist because it's poetic, right? And the world may be poetic. Yes. And so here's just two more little things. This is Paul Matsudaira, who is one of the cutting edge researchers trying to figure out, I don't know if you can see on the left, it's very light, but this is a cell crawling across a plate. And there's this question. It turns out, how does a cell crawl? Like it's on a piece of glass. How does it crawl? Does it extend pseudopods and pull itself? Does it create, like, do genes code for proteins that become pseudopods and it pushes itself? Does it just star out and then retract? These are all physical questions that you can't figure out. First of all, cells are really slow. Second of all, the physics of that type of dynamic motion it's really hard to figure out, pulling and pushing. Like everything's stuck and then things have moved. And I mean, we all know in contact, if you lay on the floor and you imagine that your leading side is falling like a bag of sand pouring out, you seem to move. If you think at the same time or at another time, oh, my far side is reaching into the ground, you also roll. If you think I'm going to extend my chest up, you roll. From the outside, these might look, for at least most outside observers, identical, right? But internally, you've organized in very different ways. So it turns out no matter how many measuring tools you put on a cell, you can't figure this stuff out because all of your measuring tools are bigger and more brutal than the cell. So the tools basically get in the way. So he's rigged up all of this data to like video cells crawling, and he's made all their genes glow in different colors. And so he can watch the genes turning on and off. And then he says, I sit and hang out with this video for weeks and days, and he tries to figure out what story he can tell about it. And he gets inspired. He's demonstrating here that he thinks it works by pulling. That these things go and there's a little bit of pulling motion. And then a few days later, he was like, no, I think it's pushing. And then his final one was that it's like satellites with like mother satellites or stars spawning daughters, and then trying to like let go of the other ones. And what was fascinating is each of those stories some story was necessary in order for him to figure out what to measure, right? Without knowing what his question was or what story he was trying to investigate, he didn't know where to put the ruler. And so if it was pulling, you'd measure very different things than if it was pushing. And when it was starring and decaying, again, you'd measure very different things. And he had like 7 terabytes of data a day, like way too much. So the story led to measuring, which then led to storying and measuring and these things. So kind of figuring out what story is happening inside of something is the kind of, you could say, the real work of science is trying to find a question that's worth trying to come up with a story about. And then you spend tedious years gathering data and trying to like get it publishable. And he had this team of engineers who would make cool graphs about the story. But he was happy with the story. He just said, I can't publish it. So then he has to make data explain the story. And Vartinieff, there's a quote here by Irmgard Vartinieff in kind of the BMC tradition, movement, not pondering, brings new knowledge. And all of these neuroscientists who I was talking to a couple weeks ago agreed with that, but they didn't know how to talk about it at all. They knew that you can't sit still, that lots of your ideas come while moving, but they weren't really willing to take the next level, which is, well, there's some people out there who are excellent at teaching you new ways of moving, and couldn't that lead to new ways of thinking? Like if we separate our head from our body, we like kind of pretend that words go on nonstop, and that's thinking in itself, without acknowledging how much of that thinking is actually fully embodied even when you're concentrating really hard. That's a type of thinking. So I'm interested in provoking conversations around that. And so here's maybe the last thing I'll just talk about here, which is this is a video that one of the geologists made. And she's inside, she had this rock that was 3 billion years old. And she's a geologist who specializes in ancient microbial life, trying to figure out if it was aerobic or anaerobic. Like, did it need oxygen or carbon dioxide in order to grow? Turns out it's really hard. First of all, it's just fossilized mats, microbial algae mats. And they're 3 billion years old and they're in little rocks. So she had this one rock and she sacrificed it by burring, like scraping it, taking a picture, scraping it, taking a picture, scraping it until it was gone. But she had a picture of like every layer of it. And then she put all those pictures in a big stack and then had a 3D data set of that rock. Now she's inside that, trying to figure something out. And she has to come up with a story. Are they growing up with structures? Structuring up? Are they hanging? Do they involve balance or tensegrity? Nobody knows. She goes to Antarctica and dives deep below the water there and tries to look at those microbial mats as maybe models. So she does a lot of things to figure out. But her big thing is, once she gets inside this rock, like, what do you do? How do you measure it? And she talks about the ease of measurement means that the measurement is limited by the decision of where to measure rather than the mechanics of actually making the measurement. This can be seen by the hesitation of the user in this example. So I'm really interested just in this little point when we're talking about pre-movement. So most geology is actually limited by the fact that the world is really big, rocks are really tall, and you can fall. So you figure out what you can measure. And you can hang, you can do some things, but sometimes you just kind of got to stand back and make it much more imprecise. Or it's super tiny, and so you can't really get your tools in there. The cave, this data, now she's like, oh, now it's easy. I can measure anything I want. I just put here, and it gives me a distance. But now the question is, what do I want to measure? So it's weird. What she's admitting is that in a lot of geology, the measurements they have are the ones they were able to take.
Yeah.
And then they figure out a story based on that. And they all know this. I mean, this is how most science works. Here, she can measure anything she wants, so now she has to figure out what's of hesitation. And so we think of hesitation as, and I use this quote from Susan Kozel, who's a video dancer and has a beautiful book called Closer, and she says, purposive decision-making covers a certain range of actions of the autonomous agent. So the idea that we're all subjects in the world and we're doing actions, so we're purposeful and we know what we're doing. We know our purpose. So this is the rational actor, if you've heard that term. But is a construction of agency generous enough to include other states and actions, such as listening, lying, meandering, stumbling, thinking, reassessing, and hesitating? The state of confusion, uncertainty, frivolity, and intimacy. So this is a really beautiful list of words of things that don't really fit the idea of purposeful, rational action. And yet, it's where we all live all the time. And it's actually all the states that contact improvisation is so beautifully designed to put us into and make into laboratory objects for us. Like, we can spend an entire score on hesitation, right? Or on meandering, right? Meander about the room. How do you meander? Where does your attention go when you're meandering? How is that different than when you're walking a straight line, right? Our scores are explorations of this whole territory of human nature that isn't part of purposeful, rational action. And so I'm going to stop now, so if you have any questions, but I'm taking this idea and noticing how this happens in science, right? And then I can use that to flip it around and tell scientists, this is why you need to pay attention to dancers, because they're actually really good at this thing that you keep skipping over. And as an anthropologist, the cave is really nice because you actually get to see scientists hesitate together. And again, it's for a lot of science, it's done in the head and on paper. So all those hesitations are part of us. They call it stream of consciousness rather than movement. So this is where I kind of intersect these two ideas. So maybe I'll just stop there, and if there's questions, we can do it. I have no idea how long I took. I usually I have 70 slides. This is, and I usually read my talks. In my world, you don't talk like I just did. You just read. So, anything?
For me, it's really interesting because I've been reading Zizek talking about like how technology and like the new science knowledge can change like the paradigm like society has, how it changes, like how people think about their life and how they relate themselves. So it would be like in this point you were saying of when you are in front of something like completely new, in that point that you have to improvise, and I was like, I'm like thinking of how this it makes it possible to change the paradigm. You are like, it's like I don't know if it's a question of what this is something that is like in my head like nowadays. So this is great to see it like this, because it's actually you have something that you haven't used, a new technique,
right?
So it's how you formulate your questions and how you're able to formulate your questions, because for your research, for example, or for anything. It's like you are stuck like in a paradigm, and I wonder if you just like are in this loop of formulating the questions like with the same logic, and how you can change that thing. And like
so maybe I can one of my interests here is we can talk about paradigms. The way in which we think knowledge works. That is wonderful because it's a container within which you can do things. And then we can also think about that same paradigm as limiting us, right? And it can limit us in terms of what we think is possible with a body. It can limit how science thinks a question can look and how they can do it. And you said when you're confronted with something new, you have to improvise. And that's one, you could say, mode of improvisation, which is, what do I do when I'm confronted by something I don't know? How do I do it? And we can look at that as improvisation. I want to put next to that kind of wanting to improvise, right? Or this kind of like thing that the CI community constantly challenges itself, like how can I recognize a habit as a habit and then do something else? Because you can like learn to use your body differently. And that's really interesting. You can learn new ways of improvising when you're confronted with something new. Right? You kind of become good at improvising. And I'm really interested in the fact that the improvisation communities, theater and dance and music, think that improvisation is really hard, right? To make it a full-time practice. And so one of the things I did was get a grant to actually bring artists into the cave, because I argued that people using the cave were having trouble with expressing what they were doing, that artists were expert at improvising expression, and that if we brought them in, they might think of new ways of using the cave that might then help the scientists do better science. Because they'd be like, oh, I didn't think about using the rest of my body when I was in the cave, and it helps. Just reminding people. And the artist got this cool tool to play with, so it was a good exchange. It's definitely the limits and abilities of paradigms is something that's important. I know everyone wants to jam, so I don't want to keep
People feel
like,
free
don't
to
talk
leave
about
if
dance.
you want.
Dance.
First of all, thank you. It's amazing work and a wonderful talk to start off the week of around these themes we want to talk about, and a beautiful way to think of contact improvisation and improvisation. I'm just wondering about this scientists moving in a cave with an object that they are exploring, and how different that is from the scientists you were describing that was using their hands to embody the folding of protein, the crystallization of protein, and thinking of, let's say, of BMC, like working with Bonnie, and then at one point you'll be in a circle and you'll be the cell wall.
Yeah.
So there's some of it. I'm wondering about the difference between creating tools like that allows you to have a more sophisticated visual experience through movement, but you're still dealing with an object, versus when your actual body and actual body movement and patterning and so forth become themselves the tool of knowledge making and representation and so forth.
Yeah. That's a good question. I mean, I don't know how much Bonnie or I don't know did they move in order to discover something about embryology, or did they read embryology and then think that they could? Sometimes it's used more as a tool to help people embody a knowledge that they've gotten from elsewhere.
Bonnie makes it very, and she usually has few examples where she would say, and people around her would say, look, Bonnie did this kind of embodied exploration, and she discovered a nerve, not less embryology. I don't know about embryology, it's older stuff, and she did that only a few years later. Scientists actually discovered. So there was some, and then I asked her once this question, and she was very explicit. She says, if I can't embody something, if I can't embodily feel it, then for me that falsifies the scientific, the anatomical description.
Yeah.
So she makes a very strong claim about the status of this kind of data or this.
And so I think it's a specific case when you're researching the body, our bodies, where the question is all these other ways of finding knowledge about our body, and then our embodied ways of finding knowledge about the body. I think that's like the question. So definitely that's its own world. And Kevin O'Connor and I ran a fascia movement research lab where we read scientific papers about fascia, and then we moved with them in a lab and in a dance studio in various ways, and let that generate questions back to the science, and just kind of how can we weave together lived experience with the scientific research. That's much more similar to this. If it's a molecule, it's in the body, maybe. If we were talking about how geological formation happens, can you explore it in your body? It's an interesting question, because there is then, and this is what the scientists talk about, is they get so close to the data by living with it that it starts moving them. They're like, I think the rock is doing this, and they show me, and then another geologist was like, oh, you're becoming one of us. And it was like there's two types of geologists, some who work on structures where things fracture, and others who use these other tools, and they think of rocks cracking, and they use their hands differently when they're demonstrating processes. And when one of them was in the cave trying to figure out that using the data she had her hands, the enemy camp did. And so the enemy is like, haha, you're becoming one of us now. So there's an example of data like pulling someone into a movement as they start embodying the force. I think there's a lot of truth to the fact that a lot of people feel knowledge, like they feel how things work dynamically, especially processual stuff that happens over time, whether it's geology or biology, or so those kind of things where you have to actually feel a process and how it unfolds. There's bodies, but then it's interesting because they're never taught explicitly, you should explore how your body works, so that when you want to explore some knowledge, you have more tools. You know how to change your tone. You don't use your arms like this. You think, oh, my arms could be soft too, right? sink in 2 centimeters past, as one of the workshops yesterday was practicing. Because then the same tool that we use to understand the world becomes that much more amazing.
And you can have thoughts you could not have
Yeah,
otherwise.
exactly.
Models.
But I think it's something you train as well, like you how you develop knowledge. You could do it like with you could do it. This makes it actually like put it like here in your eyes in front of you. But I've seen lots of people like actually doing that, like explaining and having an idea before like actually seeing it, like understanding something that it's, or I don't know, extremely far away, like a black hole or like a nano something. And they can manage to explain things and how they represent those things before getting to like that.
I
Seeing,
mean,
like this, but this is like puts you.
Yeah, this is one type of science. I don't want to use this to over-represent science, right?
No,
this
of
is
course,
a particular science that begins with data that challenges you.
Yeah,
right? You're like, oh,
that's great.
I have new data. How do I make sense of it? Like, what dynamic process could have produced this? Because in geology, the rock it's the past, right? It's time represented as a structure. And so what you have to do is take that rock and unfold time. Yeah. So that's a whole process. The biology is very similar. We get like a snapshot and we have to figure out what the dynamic processes are that are underlying that picture we get. Did you have a question?
There's just a comment about about in embryology and with one of the exercise of body is the development of when the spinal cord is as the first that creates the pouch.
Yeah.
And that movement of it's a question I have. I was wondering, okay, so there's the embryo, the spinal cord creates the pouch, and so it's creating its own environment. And I'm comparing this to some interest that I have about how we always like expand our knowledge, or how we physically do the movement of expanding knowledge or expanding space from our body. I'm wondering if it's not a reflex that will come from that, from that initial reflex, right. And if we don't repeat that initial reflex constantly in our ways of learning or extending to someone else, or like if it's not something that's like embedded, so it's an idea.
That kind of research would be great. I mean, to actually like connect some of these body practices that we who move understand changes the way we think, and say, why don't we offer this to other knowledge communities that spend a lot of time sitting and saying, would this change? So, would your average neuroscientist submit to a regime of improvisation? And would you get a new neuroscience out of it? I mean, that would be the extreme form, but it's worth asking the question how the bodily training of knowledge making shapes the kinds of knowledge that are made. I just think that's an open hypothesis, because the presumption in a lot of science is that the body is really secondary. It's almost an ideological line in the sand saying, no, that would ruin everything. We couldn't generate objective knowledge if bodies mattered.
That's like the duality. Like thinking of body is one thing and mind is another thing. Like.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Maybe last question, comment?
I'm trained as a psychologist, and so less than a couple years ago, I noticed that I would just stop talking and my hands would start moving. I'm trying to explain a dynamic to my person, and I realized that I know here what I want to say, and I'm waiting for myself to create the dance that's going to make the words come out that they're going to get.
Excellent. Yes.
Which is so, because I don't have dancer clients. They're like, I'm like,
They're not
hang on, I'll get
brought
it.
into
But
movement.
it's this place where I recognize I actually know out here non-verbally.
Yeah.
And you see it with children where they are moving their knowledge first before they bring words, and I don't think that's adequately studied.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just this.
No, that's one of the researchers at this conference was one of Jen Lin's students who does focusing.
Yeah.
And she was teaching his thinking at the edge, where you use dialogue to generate new concepts to help you describe something that you're at the edge of but can't describe. When I asked her about movement, and she explained that there was one time, she's like, oh yeah, that's a good question. She said, there was one time when I was taught to move really slowly, and I got new insights. Yeah. And I said, and? So I'm going to try to teach a CI thing there next year.
Oh, interesting.
To just give them a taste of how there are kinds of movements that they can't imagine. Right? That when they think movement, they think they already do it. They move. So they don't think past that to the idea that there are movements that could be different than what they're doing. So yes, yeah, exactly. And this process of using your body to think, I do think lots of people figure out how to internalize it. How to because there's lots of places where it's impolite to wave your arms too much. And so you do the dance. You do the dance inside, right. But again, I just use dance in a very general sense, and you've learned how to dance one way, and can you open yourself up to dancing other ways, just as the possibility that it might give you new ways of thinking and doing, is I think an interesting premise to push against. Because as I was joining the CI community, everyone would refer to, well, you can tell when someone's done too much ballet, because you have to train it out of them, because they've got an amazingly trained body, but it's now constraining them from lots of actions that they've been hit or something along the way, so that their bodies no longer do certain things. So I'm interested in that also as a type of a model of bodily production, similar to a model of knowledge production, body knowledge, that if what we're doing is always mind-body, and our knowing is always embodied, then the question is always, well, what kind? What kind of mind-body knowledge is this? What kind of, Anyways, I think we're at the end.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you.
Thank you.
So tomorrow, talk here at 5:30 if you're interested about phenomenological and science.